This is a Media Lab podcast. Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. You are in for a really special show here this week. Of course, we completed our Act 1 of Sweeney Todd. We are now in our intermission period before we start Act 2. And right before I left for New York City, I had the opportunity to speak with the music director and music supervisor of company that is on Broadway, one Mr. Joel Fram, who was a delight to talk with, an absolute utter joy. And you're going to hear that conversation here very quickly. Just two quick things before we start the episode here this week. Number one, I'm kicking myself because there was something I wanted to include in the A Little Priest episode last week, and I forgot to do it, even though I had it written down. In my conversation with Cindy Lou, I've always loved how that song starts, how choice, how rare, which are two words that you can use to talk about meat with. A choice cut of meat, and to prepare it, rare. And I think that's just brilliant little wordplay. I'm actually surprised that nobody wrote in about that fact, that I forgot to mention it, but I just wanted to clear the record here this week. Second, you may recall of a previous guest we've had on, Margaret Hall. Her book on Paul Gemignani just came out this week. It has finally been published. Definitely go and check it out. I just got my copy in the mail, and it is a phenomenal read so far. So many interesting stories and quotes, and if you are a Sondheim fan, there's so much stuff about the creation of those shows that Paul helped work on. So definitely check out that book. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Joel Fram. Joel Fram, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
You know, I am super excited. You know, as we record this, we were, just chatting here before I pushed record. I'm going to be in New York next week, so I actually haven't seen the show as of yet. But you being music supervisor and music director of company, this is going to be a long question, of course, but how did you fall into music in the first place?
Well, let's see. It depends how far back you want me to go. But I suppose, I grew up in one of those neighborhoods where everybody's houses were open to everybody's children. I mean, I suppose you could say I got my start, in first grade when I, Joel Fram, Jewish, sang the solo verse of Away in a Manger in the, first grade Christmas pageant. But I always liked to sing. I always loved musical things. And I remember, going from neighbor's house to neighbor's house and being really jealous of their pianos and, banging on their pianos and trying to make music out of their pianos. And I'm sure my neighbors probably finally said to my mother and father, you need to get him a piano so he can start banging around in your house. But once I started taking the piano, it really sort of took off from there. And I was a quick student and an eager student. It's interesting because for a long time, I was completely in tune with the top 10 contemporary pop charts. I kept track of it every day. Then one day I was going through my parents' record albums, which they kept in the closet downstairs. And I was flipping through them and I found the My Fair Lady album and the Camelot album.
The Broadway cast or the movies?
Yes, the Broadway cast. I mean, and I'm glad you asked that because it's what is this Broadway place full of these magical people? And I just fell in love with musicals right then and there. These albums seemed like, something that had somehow come from outer space, and I would, some exciting place like Brigadoon that only appeared once every 100 years. Right. And I just hoped one day I would get to be able to go to.
I've told this story before. I always call myself a bit of a dumb kid, only because, you grow up, I was watching Disney films and stuff. So, I understood music and musicals and breaking out into song. But yeah, there's a distinct moment in grade in my fifth grade, where it's like, wait, there's a place that there's like these are performed on stage. Like that just like blew my mind that was a thing that existed.
I mean, I remember once I was in junior high school, I was in choir, and there was a kind of a storage room off of the choir room. And I went into the storage room one day and was digging around, and I found out that our junior high school at one time had produced musicals, had done musicals in junior high school. And of course, we clearly hadn't done them for a while, but suddenly I was like, we must do a musical. So I begged and begged the choir director. I pestered and pestered the drama director. I designed the poster of Hello Dolly, presented by Memorial Junior High School, starring, Joel Fram. And finally, I guess they were so annoyed with me that they were like, all right, fine, we'll do a musical. Then, much to my chagrin, rather than doing Bye Bye Birdie or Hello Dolly or any of those things, they decided it would be better if we wrote our own musical. And for it was called No Place But Texas. and
what happened in No Place But Texas?
I'm sure it had to do with a boy and a girl in high school and a romantic misunderstanding that was, solved by the end. And it features songs like These Boots Were Made for Walking. And, not content with just making them write a musical, I also insisted that I got to write the overture, and there would be an overture to our musical.
That's amazing.
Isn't it?
It's right up there with like the Gypsy overture, Which...
Yeah, exactly. Gypsy, Funny Girl, and No Place But Texas.
Was the impetus then for you then, like in these early years, you were going to be like the performer on stage? Like, is that what you really wanted to do?
Yes, I definitely wanted to be an actor. And it was, in Houston, we have this amazing, amazing theater organization, Theater Under the Stars. And they produce like 4 musicals a year. So I was in the theater school there, and I would play rehearsals for them. And I would, every now and then be in one of the shows. And I remember just thinking, one day I'm going to be on Broadway singing and tap dancing and acting. The only downside to that dream, of course, was that I couldn't dance and I couldn't act. So I sort of had to...
The three-legged stool was a bit wobbly, is what you're trying to say.
A little bit wobbly in my case. And I remember every time I would want to be in a show and I wouldn't get into the show, I'd be asked to play rehearsals for the show or play in the pit of a show. And so gradually, I think I came to realize that my talents sort of were leading me into a music director path as opposed to a Broadway star kind of path.
Right.
Which, let's face it, it turned out better, I think for me that way. So...
Yeah, you seem to be doing fairly well for yourself here overall.
Yeah, it's all right.
Before we jump into that specifically, this is a podcast all about Stephen Sondheim specifically. Do you recall the first Stephen Sondheim show you became familiar with?
So the very first Stephen Sondheim show I became familiar with was Merrily We Roll Along.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
For me, this came out when I was in high school. And I remember my friend and fellow actor, fellow thespian in high school, Jimmy Caleri, who is now like a very famous casting director in New York.
Yeah.
He said to me, oh my gosh, there's this new show by Stephen Sondheim. P.S. I didn't even know who that was. And you have to listen to it. The show goes backwards. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, the reprises come first, and then the songs are later. And the chronology of the story goes backwards. So I remember sitting in his room, listening to the Merrily We Roll Along cast album, which is a very exciting cast album. And the thought that like a bunch of college-age students were doing a Broadway musical made it even more exciting to me. Like, I'm going to be in college soon. Maybe I'll be doing a Broadway musical soon. And from there, I really did become interested in all the other Sondheim shows. I remember hearing Little Night Music for the first time,
Hmm.
and just even as a high school student thinking, oh, this is so beautiful. Or when I discovered Sweeney Todd and just how epic and grand and exciting that score is, and
Yeah, yeah.
how fun the story is, that the whole plot of Sweeney Todd really is just so fun and entertaining and gripping. So I gradually ended up saying, well, if I'm going to know one of them, I need to know all of them. And what was kind of wonderful was that, of course, there were more to come. So I remember in
Yeah.
college, Sondheim wrote a new musical, and that musical was Into the Woods. And I couldn't wait for the cast album to come out and then run into New York and see it. The notion that not only was there this whole body of work that I could discover, but that Sondheim was creating more and more work as time went
Hmm.
on. That was also very exciting.
I feel like it's something that becomes even more meaningful as time goes on because it's like, yeah, this is this cool like new Sondheim show coming up, but then of course Into the Woods becomes like a huge thing
Hmm.
too, and now
Hmm.
it's like, oh, I wish I had been alive to go and see Into the Woods. Like I was there, I could have done it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, but that is the nature of Broadway. I mean, who knows? Hopefully someday someone might be saying, oh, I wish I was there when they originally put together Come From Away, or I wish I was
Hmm.
there when they, for that first company of MJ. I mean, there's just we
Right.
forget that what we do, we leave a record of it, and that people can experience the show without having to come see the show, which is why recordings are so important, I think. And that people like me who are in Houston, Texas, who at the time I was listening to My Fair Lady and I was listening to Camelot, thought that Broadway was so far away, it was completely out of my reach, could become part of it in a certain sense and certainly obsessed with it in another.
Yeah, I think you're so right about the importance about recordings. Like something I brought up on this show before is that it is a very unique thing for even people that are peers of Stephen Sondheim to have a recording of every one of their shows, their original casts. The fact that there is even a Merrily We Roll Along and Anyone Can Whistle recordings is like bonkers, really, when you think about it. Seems how combined those two shows did not run 2 weeks. So
Hmm.
like,
Hmm. And then you think about how sometimes the imperative changes so that, the record producer had to beg to record the Follies at Avery Fisher
right.
concert. But thank goodness he did. I mean, thank goodness he
Hmm.
put his job on the line to do it, because we'd be so much poorer without that recording, without capturing that recording, which I think really sparked a re-interest in Follies. And I
Sure.
never thought I would ever see a professional production of Follies one. And I think I've seen something like 6 or 7 first class professional productions of
Right.
it now.
Yeah. So your hopes of stardom are somewhat dashed as far as being out on the stage.
Yes.
I'm just curious how do you pursue that? Like how do you be like, okay, I'm doing well with like this music supervisor or music director kind of role. Like how do you get to the next level?
Well, there are two ways about it. And I
Hmm.
certainly took the other way.
Okay.
I have friends like Ted Sperling and Stephen Aremus. They came to the city and almost immediately they were music directing a show.
Hmm.
They were either the associate conductor on a show or they were conducting their own Broadway show. Maybe they played rehearsals for a little while. Maybe they were the associate conductor once or twice, but pretty soon after they got there, they were music directing their own project. My career path was a little longer. It's the other way to go about it, I would say. I would coach singers. And then every so often, a singer would say, would you come to my audition and play for it? Because I don't really trust there'll be an audition pianist who can play
Right.
this complicated piece of music. Although I should say that audition pianists are amazing in my experience. So I
Hmm.
would go along and I would play Giants in the Sky or whatever,
Right.
Meadowlark or the other,
Hmm.
whatever else is considered to be a tricky piano accompaniment. And then gradually casting directors would say, hey, you kid behind the piano, would you like to come play a day of auditions for us? And I'd say, sure. And then one day, some music director sitting behind the piano was like, hey, you kid behind the piano who played this day of auditions, we're looking for another rehearsal pianist for the Music Man. Do you want to come and play rehearsals? And then eventually someone would ask me to sub on their keyboard book in the pit. So I would be, once in a while be playing in a Broadway orchestra, subbing for a person who was taking the night off. And then someday someone would be like, hey, you sub who shows up every now and then, we need like an extra conductor. Do you want to learn to conduct the show? And then, one day someone said, hey, you, do you want to be my associate on a show? And then one day someone said, hey, you, Joel Fram, I need a music director for this show. It's going to be you. Are you interested? And I said, yes, I'd be very interested. So
what was that show?
Well, it depends, how you like to decide when you've arrived. I mean, certainly, I played rehearsal piano for The Secret Garden.
Nice.
My first Broadway show that I conducted was Cats. But of course, before that, I was very fortunate in that I conducted shows at the Old Globe. I've conducted 2 national tours. I conducted many, many shows. Something like 20 or 25 shows at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle. So I really was honing my craft and creating, really lovely, great art around the country. And then eventually conducted my first Broadway show. And, I always like to laugh that one's list of shows is always a kind of a fascinating thing to look at when you start to look at them together. So I conducted Cats, I conducted Wicked on Broadway. I got married and moved to London, so I conducted Wicked in the West End. I came back to New York and conducted Scandalous on Broadway. And in the same breath, I am now in New York conducting an amazing revival of Company on Broadway. So there's all sorts of different experiences.
Hey everyone, just Kyle breaking into the conversation here to tell you about some of the people and organizations that help this show continue to go. Of course, if you'd like to help support the show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That's greatly appreciated. And if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge thanks to the God That's Good tier from Patreon. That's Jack, Todd, Carrie, Louise, Christopher, and Stephen. Putting it together as a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. The Alberta Podcast Network promotes and supports Alberta-made podcasts and connects their audiences with Alberta-based businesses and organizations. This week, we actually have 2 new sponsors to discuss. First up is TELUS Storyhive, and on this episode, we'd like to tell you about what's new with our friends at TELUS Storyhive. Calling on all new and emerging creators in BC and Alberta, TELUS Storyhive's All-Access Documentary Edition is funding 40 creators with $20,000 each in production funding, mentorship, training, and distribution on TELUS Optic TV. You can pitch any documentary idea that you're passionate about, and you could be in the running to join the Storyhive community. You have to apply by May 30th at storyhive.com/apply. This episode of Putting It Together is also brought to you by Alberta Blue Cross. Life as a business owner can be hectic, to say the least. Alberta Blue Cross understands that. They offer flexible health, dental, life, and disability coverage for your employees. Even better, you can let your staff enroll and manage their coverage at any time and on any device. That makes life easier for them and for you. You've got this when it comes to group coverage for your small business, and Alberta Blue Cross has got your back. To learn more and explore your options, you can head over to ab.bluecross.ca. We've talked a little bit on this show too about many of Sondheim's collaborators. One of the biggest one being Paul Gemignani. Like he had a lot to do with like the sound of what we consider Sondheim sound. And I know some people have kind of explained it to me, but I like to go over this again just to get it under my head. Like I basically understand what like a conductor is doing, but what is the difference between what a music director is doing and what a music supervisor is doing?
Well, it's interesting. When I first started in New York, there really weren't music supervisors. Basically, you would music direct the show, i.e. you would teach it and put it together. And then you stayed with your show as long as you stayed with it. And if there was a tour, you looked after it. If there was a second tour, you looked after it. You would teach it to the conductor of the tour and send it out and go out and check on it. And if you left the show, the next music director sort of inherited all those jobs. Music supervision is something I believe sort of came over from the UK when there were all these Cameron Mackintosh shows on Broadway. It's a model that he sort of created, having one music supervisor look after the worldwide interest of that particular show. In this case, in my specific case with Company, as the music supervisor, my initial job was to, first of all, help Marianne understand how music functioned in the show, and also how making the changes to the show that we were proposing would change the music. And then to put together the right people who would help us realize those changes in a way that supported her vision. So putting together
This is Marianne Elliott, the director, just for people if they don't know.
Yes, Marianne Elliott, the amazing, amazing director of Company and many, many other things. As a music supervisor, I am helping guide her in that process. And then I am also putting a department together, finding an associate music director and finding an orchestrator and finding a dance arranger and an incidental music arranger and putting an orchestra together that will help reflect what we're hoping will happen with the show. All of those things fall under sort of the aegis of my department, music supervision. So it's really, in a way, it's a very creative position. And then when we jump into rehearsals, of course, I taught the company the show. I worked with all of the leads on their songs. I helped make decisions about what music went where, why we needed a certain piece of music in a certain place, or why we couldn't cut a certain piece of music, what function it served in Sondheim's score. I basically was like a conduit between Marianne and Sondheim in that sense.
Yeah. Because did you start over with the London production as well?
That's right.
That's what I thought.
One day, I was teaching a musical theater writing course at the National Theatre in London. And on the very first day of the very first class, Marianne, who had been approached to do another musical at the time, who was an associate artist of the National then, wanted to learn more about musicals. And she and my husband were roommates at university. So I knew her sort of, I know. So, and by the way, my husband is also a music director. So, sort of runs in the family. She wanted to know more about musicals. So there she was sitting in the front row with her notebook and her pencil. And I was like, oh my God, that's Marianne Elliott is sitting in the front row. Like the first time I'm giving this class, I felt the pressure
just throws you off a bit.
Yeah, just mount. But then when Chris and Marianne came up with this idea for Company and for changing the gender, she called me and said, I'd love to sit down with you and explore how this will impact the show. And so she and Rosalie Craig, who was the original Bobby in London, and I sat down together in my apartment and we went through the script page by page, line by line, song by song, and said, what are we trying to do? What do we need to change to do it? And how will that impact the show? How will that impact the score? How will that impact the script? And probably most tellingly, what do you think Steve Sondheim is going to say about all of this?
Right, right. Well, he ended up really loving it. Like he was very gracious about his opinions on that version of Company for sure. We probably do not have time to go into all the nitty gritty here, but I am fascinated by what you just brought up here because, of course, I don't know why I hadn't thought about this before. When you do have a female Bobby, you're going to have to transpose that music a little bit, like different keys, probably different registers, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I guess just ask the question, maybe the obvious question: how did that change the music for you?
Well, we're lucky in that, on the whole, sequences like the opening number pretty much stayed intact, right? You didn't have to force things into different keys. But certainly, numbers like Have I Got a Guy for You, which leads into Someone is Waiting. Have I Got a Guy for You went from men to women. Someone is Waiting went from a man to a woman. And in that way, I was lucky because actually the keys had to go down, right? They're pitched high in men's voices. And so in order to get the same effect, I had to move them down, both of those numbers down, so they would fit more comfortably in the women's voices, in their sort of middle range. And so I got to keep that beautiful key relationship between the end of What Do You Want to Get Married For and the top of Someone is Waiting that Sondheim had created. Finding a key for Being Alive and Marry Me a Little, again, we had to create interesting transitions to get into the woman's key for those numbers. Now, happily, we came up with some, I think, really beautiful transitions that are kind of seamless. But again, those numbers had to come down a few steps in order to be really in the kind of exciting sort of belt range of a woman's voice.
Right.
Which is really the sort of equivalent place of hearing a baritone sing in sort of the upper register of his voice. You had to think of what is the equivalent of hearing Dean Jones high up on like an E and F sharp, which is a G, which are those big baritone notes. And the answer, of course, is for women, B flat, C, D, which means lower, but sounding richer and more exciting for a woman.
Yeah, it's just fascinating that you do have to be very intentional. Like, it's also that snowball effect, right? You change one thing and it does have this huge impact as you go through it.
I mean, I will tell you, one of the first questions I asked Marianne before we got to a single line of dialogue or a single note of music is, when do you want this to be set? Is it set in the 70s or is it set now? And it was an interesting question because every bit of the music, is woven out of some 70s material.
Yeah.
It was written to be a contemporary show in 1970. So the takeaway from that, of course, is what was contemporary in 1970? Well, the sound of a variety show. I mean, if you look at the opening number, it is very much the opening number from a variety show, right? It has that, da 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 da, that kind of smooth trumpet flugelhorn feel. Barcelona is a funny number, but you can almost hear a version of it that like Dionne Warwick would be singing, or Cilla Black, right? So it is consciously written in a contemporary for the 70s style. So we had to say to ourselves, if we set it in a contemporary period, i.e. 2017, 2022, what do we do about the fact that the orchestrations are 70s and that the music itself is kind of 70s?
Yeah.
First of all, we decided to set it in 2020, 17, 2018, 2022, because in 1970, I suppose people were asking 35-year-old men, why aren't you married yet? Right? People got married younger, I suppose. And it was just assumed that women would get married. But in 2022, in 2017, in any time in the last 2 decades, I think people have stopped caring about whether or not men are married or not at any age. First of all, men still have a significant amount of power So not being married really doesn't affect the rest of their lives. Also, it seems that men have an easier time of being older and getting married. Really, in 2017, in 2022, people are still asking women at 35, why aren't you married yet? They are no longer asking men that, but they are asking women that for sure. And it's always accompanied by, your biological clock is ticking. You're not getting any younger.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting exploration within this version is like, it makes that exploration a little bit more richer, because not that I wouldn't actually want to see another production of Company, 15 years from now, to go back to the 70s and explore that maybe a little bit again. A woman in the 70s does change the tenor of the show completely. If it is set in 1970 specifically, women could not have credit cards. Like, they had to ask permission to open up bank accounts. Like, it just changes it a little bit too much to what the purpose of the actual show is. So yeah, you have to contemporize it a bit so that it's like, okay, we can explore the same thing within a modern context.
Yeah, I mean, Marianne had a very specific story she wanted to tell. And for all the reasons you mentioned, you could not tell it setting it in the 70s. But it became even more imperative to tell it setting it in 2018, 2022.
Yeah.
But the question was then, how do we get the music to match the story that we are now trying to tell? And I remembered the production of Parade at the Donmar that my friend Jason Robert Brown wrote. And the original orchestration of Parade is amazing. And at the Donmar, they wanted to do it with, fewer pieces, fewer instruments. And at the time, David Cullen essentially reorchestrated the show for 9 pieces, I believe. And it was one of the most amazing things I had ever heard. It wasn't that David Cullen made 9 pieces sound like 24 pieces. That's not what Jason wanted. If he wanted it to sound like 24 pieces, hire 24 pieces. He made these 9 pieces sound like the most amazing chamber ensemble, and which really suited the production of Parade that Rob Ashford directed. And I remember Jason, who can be somewhat difficult to please in these matters, so happy. And I was so impressed with how David Cullen did it. He really, really respected the work that Jason had done, and yet created an orchestration that was appropriate for the size of the production and for the players in the ensemble. So I had it in the back of my mind all along that I really wanted David to do the reorchestration for Company. Also, let's face it, he orchestrated my favorite moment in Phantom of the Opera, which is in Masquerade, when she says, think of it, a secret engagement, look, your future bride. That is just the best orchestration in the world. So, and in a very touching way, Sondheim said, there would not be a Stephen Sondheim without a Jonathan Tunick. So I would like you to ask Jonathan first. If Jonathan says no, and this was very generous of Steve, he said, you're free to choose whomever you think is most appropriate. So I called Jonathan and I explained to him sort of the size of the project, that, several numbers, 5, 6, 7 numbers would have to be completely reorchestrated because they were going to be transposed so drastically. Also, that we were planning on doing a new TikTok ballet, so that would have to be orchestrated. And Jonathan said, as interesting as this sounds, I'm in the middle of orchestrating Carousel. I can't do it. So, I mean, there could be worse reasons for having to say no, So I called David and I said, here's the brief. We are trying to do Company set in 2018. We want to rethink the orchestrations, and we want to make them as contemporary as they were for 1970. We want to make these new orchestrations contemporary for 2018 without changing the structure of the music, without changing Sondheim's melodies, without changing his harmonic structures. We have to respect what he gives us, but we have to put these songs into modern clothing. And he said, I have been waiting 50 years for someone to ask me to orchestrate a Sondheim show. Yes, I'd love to do it. and I think one of the great glories of this production are the orchestrations. They are They feel contemporary, they're interesting, they're full of color, and yet they ultimately celebrate what Sondheim wrote, which is a real accomplishment.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if we blew past this. Have you seen another production of Company before this?
I have seen many productions of Company,
Okay.
and I have played the piano in about 3 of them. So,
Okay, okay.
and all of them were always set in 1970, the ones that
Right.
I worked on. And of course, the ones that I saw, like the one at the Roundabout, ultimately tried to contemporize it a bit. But I mean, not, I
Still
think,
with, yeah.
in the whole scale way that Marianne really tried, and I think
Mhm.
succeeded in contemporizing the piece. But just to be fair, I will say that when we pitched this to Sondheim, he was like, that's a really interesting idea. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's going to work, but you're welcome to try it. And you know what? If you fuck it up, it'll be all your fault. So we had our work cut out for us.
It is very true, though. It's like, hey, you're taking this on. I have nothing to do with it. I want to just quickly go through some, like, quote unquote favorites. You actually get to be my guinea pig for this. This is something new I've started to try and do. We just kind of like rapid fire these 3 questions. So for you, I know this is like almost like choosing a favorite child or a favorite dog or something like that. But what is your favorite song from the show?
My favorite song, oh, that is a hard one. I would have to say that one of my favorite songs, but possibly my favorite, in the end, I love Someone Is Waiting.
Mm,
Partly because changing the names seems like an impossible task. It's
yeah,
all built on women's names. And yet
right.
we changed it to men's names, and there's only one rhyme in the entire song, and that is Joanne rhymes with I'll find you if I can. And
Hmm,
yet
hmm.
we discovered a rhyme that works just as well and means exactly the same thing, which is or Paul, and it rhymes with if you exist at all. And it's just
Right,
such an
right.
elegant solution. And also, David Cullen's orchestration for that is magical. It sounds like it sounds like a song that Ravel wrote. I mean, it's really a favorite moment.
Which is actually high praise because I believe Sondheim really, really loves Ravel too. It's one of his favorite composers. This is kind of similar, but what favorite moment or scene in the show?
Well, my favorite moment in the show, this sounds so self-aggrandizing, but
Hmm.
is probably Drive a Person Crazy. It was the hardest thing to reconceive. And of course, it went from 3 women to 3 men.
Hmm.
And so at first, I was thinking of ideas like, well, I'll rearrange it so that it sounds like the pentatonics. Although, by the way, the pentatonics is 4 men and a woman, so that's already an inexact idea.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was like, or maybe I'll have the other men like sing along in the background, or. And they were all terrible ideas. I mean, simply dreadful ideas. But again, this notion of what was Sondheim doing and how can we honor it made me think what Sondheim did and what is so clever about this moment is he took a style, which is the Andrews sisters,
Hmm.
their style of singing. And what do we think about that style, women's close harmony and the Andrews sisters? Well, they were very popular in the 30s and the 40s, a time when the world was falling apart. We were at one point in the middle of World War II. And so they basically cornered the market on upbeat, fun, optimistic songs. And so he framed this moment where these 3 girlfriends are telling Bobby what a complete bastard he is
Hmm.
as an Andrews sister song. So if you just listened to it and didn't listen to the lyrics that carefully, you'd be like, oh, they're so chipper, they're so cheerful. But when you start to listen to what they say, which is, you're a complete brat, I hate you, why am I even with you? The irony of those 2 things together make that moment so funny. And then I
Hmm.
realized that I would have to respect what he was trying to do and what I was trying to do. And so, of course, the equivalent sound basically for men are groups like the High Lows, the
Hmm.
Williams brothers. So
Right, right, right.
I did a lot of research about how those groups are put together. The theater version of that, of course, is Forever Plaid, right? That's the
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
the sound. And so basically, I did a draft of that vocal arrangement, as the Williams brothers, as the Modernaires, as the High-Lows. And I will say that I labeled the draft A, draft B, draft C, and I would send them to Steve, and he would send back pointed notes like, have you ever heard of unison? Or that's interesting, the melody at the end of the bridge. Why don't we try the one I wrote? Things like that. So in the end, I got there. The one we're doing in the show is Drive a Person Crazy, version L, as in Lima. So I went through many drafts, but I'm really proud of how that turned out. I think
cool.
It really works the way that moment was intended to work. So in terms of favorite moments, this is so terrible to say because I arranged it, but that is one of my favorite moments in the show.
This might answer the last favorite question here, which is, was there a favorite discovery in the rehearsal process?
My favorite discovery, I'm going to say two. One is a broad one, which is my favorite discovery, and this is all due to Marianne and the group of actors that we were working with, is that the show is so funny. The show is so funny. I think you can read the script of Company and think, oh, this could feel pretty dated. I don't know how funny this is going to be. Or someone could tell you, Company is a diatribe on the state of marriage. And you could think, that's not going to be that fun or funny. The show is so funny. The things that the actors have discovered, the excavation that Marianne has done to find the funny, the show is so funny. And that was a delightful discovery. Perhaps my favorite discovery of all, though, was changing Amy to Jamie, which, to give credit where it's due, was Chris Harper's idea. So now you have a gay couple. And that scene between Jamie and Paul, where basically the heart of the scene is Jamie saying to Paul, just because we can doesn't mean we should. I've never seen a marriage that worked. You're not for me, Paul. I just don't love you enough. The first time I heard that scene, I cried. I really broke down and cried. I had no idea that scene or any scene in Company would be that moving. And to me, because we made the decision to make that a gay couple, I feel that was integral to why that scene works so beautifully now and why it is so moving to me, but to everyone now. That scene really does get gasps from the audience. And I feel really proud of that moment.
Yeah, I can't wait to experience it. Not to get too introspective here, but this has popped into my head, like just thinking about that moment, but also that very end song of being alive, whether it's going through this process or just how you felt over like the last 2.5 years. Is there something in your life that helps you feel like being alive?
I totally understand the question. And there are certainly songs I carry with me as I go through life. And songs that come to mind when I am dealing with difficult moments in my life, or just songs that I find inspiring, or songs that I am glad I know. I wouldn't necessarily say that for me, I take the lesson of being alive with me in any particular way. But what I will say about both The Ladies Who Lunch, which is an incredible experience to conduct with Patty, and Being Alive, which is an incredible experience to conduct with Katrina, is that both of those songs remind me every single night why I chose to do what I do and why it was worth the pain of 1 year and 8 months of a shutdown to stick it out and come back. And I mean, on a personal note, I've really been dealing with long COVID for about 2 years now. And it was a terrible struggle. It continues to be a struggle, but I am certainly much better than I was even 1 year ago. But there were really dark moments when I did not think I would be able to do what I love to do or come back to the show that I helped create. And those were very bitter moments. So when I conduct Ladies Who Lunch and when I conduct Being Alive, then I know, because it is such an incredible experience to be working with the musicians I'm working with and to be working with the actors I'm working with on a show that I had the honor to help put together. Then I know that those struggles were worth it. That it was a dark year and 8 months, but it was worth struggling through, and the light at the end of the tunnel was a real light.
Well, final two questions here then. Like, there's been a lot that has been written about the gender swapping of Bobby and company. But is there any other show that you can think of? It doesn't have to be Sondheim, but a classic text that you think would be interesting to play around? Maybe not the whole cast, but a role that could be swapped?
That is such a good question. I have to say, you have really caught me off guard. I'm trying to think of another show where, because it's interesting, and perhaps it's my lack of imagination, but I, myself personally, would never have thought to make Bobby a woman. But when Marianne said the idea to me, I got so excited because it just seemed like such a great idea right off the bat. It was one of those, why didn't I think of that ideas? You know, like wheels on suitcases.
Where have these been my whole life?
Exactly. Let's see. What would be good? I mean, hey, could you switch the genders of Billy and Julie in Carousel? I mean, there is a text that people sometimes tell us is quite troubled for a number of reasons. And would switching the gender make us see it in the new light, or make it troubling in a different way? That's a good question. Like, and I think you buy a female Bobby. You know, would you buy a female Carousel Barker? You know, that's hard to say. Like, I think that's what the big thing here, because I don't even have a good answer myself, because I think what's interesting is that Marianne and all the other collaborators, like, they really intentionally, okay, if we're doing this, it has to do this. Like, there's a lot of thought that went into it. It wasn't just like, we're just going to make a female Bobby and go with it. There was more to it than that. And also, don't forget that we had one imperative from Steve. He said, that's great that you want to explore all of these themes in a 2018 context, but company says what it says with the words and the music that it says it. And if you need to change a theme, if you need to change what someone says in order to say what you want it to say, you're not allowed to do that. Write your own musical if it's not saying what you need it to say. Because we spent a lot of time writing this one, so you have to respect the material that we give you. It has to be about interpretation, not renovation.
Right. Yeah. No, that's true. If I was someone who could grant wishes, if you could do another Sondheim show, is there another Sondheim show you would love to jump into to do the music for?
Well, first of all, you know, you already have granted one of my wishes, which is to be on a podcast. So,
great.
Thank you for that. There's two I would really love to do. I would love to do Sweeney Todd. I have loved that score for so long, and I just think it works so well. I mean, I sometimes am in the kitchen cooking, and I've got Sweeney Todd on, and I will put down the onion and put down the knife and just say, "This is brilliant. This is brilliant." The other one I would love to do is Passion. And I would love to do a production directed by Marianne Elliott of Passion, just because her way of seeing is so extraordinary. And I think, P.S., I would love to do a production of Sweeney Todd directed by Marianne Elliott as well.
Yeah.
But there's something about Passion because it's so mysterious, and there's so many things unexplained and so many things that are left
Those
unsaid.
are also like the two almost like diametrically opposed Sondheim shows too.
Yes.
Just in scale and musicality and everything, right?
That's exactly right. You know, but Sondheim is just like a good nail biter, you know, a good thriller of a story. And Passion is this strange weaving of emotions and the power they have. And it's an intimate little chamber piece. So yes, if I'm allowed to pick two, those would be the two.
Yeah, definitely do Passion. That would give me another good excuse to come and see a production of Passion. I keep telling people, Passion is the show that I tried to, I think, listen to it way too early. Like I was in my teens. I'm like, I don't get this show. And then the older I get, I'm like, this show is amazing. Like I get so much out of this.
It's so funny that you say that. When I first saw Passion, I think like you, I thought, well, there's parts of this that are so beautiful, but I'm not sure I get it. And then the older I got, the more obsessed with it I got. And it is now like a desert island disc. You know, I definitely would probably take, I mean, forgive me, Marvin Hamlish, with whom I also worked on, because, you know, I did Sweet Smell of Success also.
Right.
But like, I think I would probably take Passion to a desert island maybe before I took a chorus line. And I'm sorry to all those people who love a chorus line, but, you know, for me, it would be Passion.
That's amazing.
I hope you get a lot of angry letters about that.
Right. Yeah, bring them in. Joel, thank you so much for joining me here today. If people did want to like check out more about you and what you're up to, do you have any type of like social media or anything that people can follow?
You know
or
what?
Website?
I would love to tell you I do, but I don't. So you're more than you're more than welcome to friend me on Facebook, and you're more than welcome to Google me. You know, I work in all sorts of places. At the moment, I'm putting a gala together for Symphony Space with my friend Annette Jolette, which is actually going to be a concert of the songs of a Little Night Music. So, you know, it's quite the Sondheim year, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So, you know, feel free to like look on the Symphony Space website or Google me, whatever you like to do. You can find me, I'm sure.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Joel.
All right, a pleasure. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I really, really loved it, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Thank you to the Alberta Podcast Network, to Tell a Story Hive, and to Alberta Blue Cross this week. Putting It Together is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we continue our intermission period by talking about Sondheim Unplugged. He never should have gone electric anyways. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.